So yesterday I finished this book. It's called Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. It is a compilation of a larger amount of texts called the moral epistles, or sometimes they're called the letters to Lucilius. And it is a collection of supposed letters that Seneca wrote to this guy, this Roman general named Lucilius. And for those who are unfamiliar with Seneca, he was a Roman philosopher in the early first century who was also the tutor of Nero when Nero was younger. So when Nero was still growing up as a child before he became king, his tutor was this guy named Seneca. And, this is before Nero became all evil and cruel and was killing all these people and be torturing everyone. But before that, Seneca was his tutor, supposedly. And what is very fascinating about this group of texts in particular, these Stoic texts, is that the format of it is very bizarre because it is written as letters to this guy named Lucilius, right? But then apparently we don't actually know for sure if Lucilius is a real person or if he actually existed, because there doesn't seem to be any actual correspondence between Seneca and Lucilius. In other words, there is no letters back from Lucilius to Seneca. All the writings in here is like one-way letters. And if you read more about it, it was actually at the time a genre of writing in which you'd write a letter, publish it publicly, and then as a way for other people to actually learn truths or learn things, it was in the format of an epistle or a letter. So it's very weird because it's some kind of weird metafiction, because in many of the letters he seems to be addressing something that Lucilius has supposedly said, but apparently if Lucilius doesn't exist, he's like, it's this weird kind of facade-ish thing where he's writing a letter addressing a fake idea or a fake point in order to elucidate a bigger, grander, more interesting theme or whatever for whatever Seneca felt like writing about at the time. And this was written in 65 AD, or at least it was finished in 65 AD. And again, most of the texts really cover his Stoic philosophy in the tradition of many other philosophers that follow him, such as, Epictetus, for example, or Marcus Aurelius. Seneca was very influential at the time, and what is very fascinating for me, what I learned personally, was that while reading the book, it struck me just how relevant a lot of what he was talking about, a lot of what he was saying, seemed to my life and my life generally today. I think when I was younger, I'd watch these old silent films from the early 20th century, black and white silent movies, and I'd be kind of amazed by just how much I was able to resonate with them, how much I was able to relate with them. I was thinking like, wow, even though this was made so long ago, and this was very long, most people, they find the same effect with movies 20 years ago, but and this is like a movie, say, 70, 80 years ago, I'd watch it and think, wow, a lot of the things that they're grappling with, a lot of the themes that they're talking about, I can relate to very well, I can resonate so much, and at the time when I first realized this, I felt like my mind was expanding. I was like, wow. So it gave me a better perspective of just that a lot of the things that we worry about today, a lot of things that we grapple with, a lot of the ideas that we still struggle with. Wow, people in the early 20th century, they struggled with it as well. I think there's this wrong notion in which, and I have a theory about it. I think it's actually because of technology. I think because my generation, maybe the generation above me as well, and below me, there's this sense in which technology is increasing at such a rapid rate over the last 20, 30, 40 years that there is this wrong misconception that the degree at which technology is increasing is proportionate with the degree at which things in general have become more complex. This is something I've been thinking about over the last few weeks, and I think it's such a big fallacy, but I do think that's the cause of it. So, for example, I see these videos online of these kids who are so surprised by like what an old video game console looks like and why the graphics are so bad. And I think when you keep seeing all these things of more outdated forms of technology, you think that, well, things before must have been so simple, so much simpler, so much less complex, that you have a cognitive mistake that you assume everything else is just as simple and complex. So, for example, this hit me even stronger when I read this book, because this was written in 65 AD. This is nearly 2,000 years ago. People have been grappling with so many of the similar issues that we still grapple with today. For example, one of the things he talks about here is the feeling in which one has to. I guess that Stoicism in general is supposed to be like being disconnected from the passions, not being too drawn by emotion and being more grounded in some kind of reason or some kind of rationale that will make you live life less in the throes of like suffering or something. So, for example, one of the things he talks about is he talks about the death of someone. So he says that if someone dies, there is no he argues that there is no point to grieving for someone's death. For example, he says that, well, why would you want to grieve so heavily for someone when, because I think he says that he paints a picture in which he says that normally what people expect, why people like to grieve so much, is because they feel like if they're not grieving, then it doesn't amount to the amount of grieving is like proportionate to the amount of love that you had for someone. So the longer you grieve, the deeper your love was for that person. But he argues something like, well, that is a mistake to think about, because, for example, if you associate grief with the amount of love you have, it is a fact that eventually everyone has to stop grieving. And the fact that, and so being able to acknowledge that fact means that you are also sort of acknowledging the fact that your love will eventually dissipate and end. And it's just he doesn't see it's not a right parallelism between the two. So he says, well, someone dies, you should just be okay with it. As far as you know, they're in a better place, and the amount of love you have doesn't have to necessarily make you feel very negatively about it. And he has all these different things. Like, I mean, he's surprisingly very progressive for his time. He talks about, one of the letters he talks about going to this gladiator fight. So I guess not everything has been the same over the last thousands of years, but he talks about going to a gladiator fight. And I'm surprised. I'm reading the thing, and then he talks about going to this gladiator fight, people killing each other, and he actually says in the book, like, this doesn't make any sense. This is so unethical. This is not ethical in any way. We should treat these people with an amount of dignity that they deserve. We shouldn't make them kill each other for our entertainment. This is so morally wrong. In many ways, this Letters from a Stoic, this is very much a moral treatise to some degree. He talks about, he's very progressive about slavery. This is in 65 AD. He talks about how we should have slaves eat at the same table as you. We shouldn't look down at slaves. If we have slaves, we should treat them as equal as human beings as well, because we're all the same. We're all human beings. Therefore, the slaves and us, we're all the same. And at the end of the day, death is the greatest equalizer. We all die the same way. We all die eventually, and that knowledge that we all die eventually shows that we are all we're all the same to some degree. He talks about that. He's a very big proponent of asceticism, or the idea that one should not indulge in excessive materiality, for example. He talks about how, you shouldn't be so, drawn to riches, for example, or to living a lavish lifestyle or something. These are things that eventually go away, and when you are in the midst of engaging with these lavish things, you suffer because of, there's a whole thing. So he talks about all these things. It's very fascinating to read, because again, a lot of the things he talks about, it sounds very, they're very meaningful, and they're full of wisdom. And what most struck me was this really strong feeling that it has been going on for all these years. 2,000 years ago, we're probably just very, very similar with them. Maybe the level of our socialization is different, but then they were grappling with similar things as we are grappling. They're grappling with similar aspects of life. Humanity, philosophy hasn't really changed it has changed in different ways, but a lot of the very basic cores of philosophy are still there. People are wondering about the meaning of life. 2,000 years ago, a lot of this stuff, again, I was just so struck by the amount of level I was able to resonate with this. And I really highly recommend anyone reading this, because again, it really put things into perspective. This is in 65 AD, and so much of it is so relatable. I mean, maybe there's a lot of kudos to the translator for modernizing some of the language, but it's incredible, I think. I thought it was incredible to read, and I learned so much about it. And in terms of my own intellectual progress or whatever, I've been reading a lot over the last few months. I've read some texts on Buddhism. I read Keiji Nishitani's On Buddhism, which is like his summary of Buddhist thought in the 20th century. I didn't talk about this, but I read another book called An Introduction to Chan Buddhism, which is Zen in Japan. And there are many similarities with Buddhist thought and Stoicist thought. A lot of it talks about being away from desire and trying to live a more ascetic life. It's very fascinating. I think I learned so much from this, and while you can read it and you can also think, well, all of this sounds like self help stuff. Yeah, but who also argues for the purpose of philosophy says like, well, many philosophers at least during his time, he says that he was criticizing other philosophers as people who were trying to solve all these things. He was trying to solve specific things, but not necessarily solving how to live a better life, how to live a happier life, how to live a good way. And while there is some kind of denigrating idea right now, so the idea of self help sounds kind of like a lesser thing. To some degree, self improvement is something that one needs to kind of strive towards, and it's interesting how to read just the perspective of how people were thinking about this back in 2,000 years ago. So yeah, I'm a big fan of. Oh well, okay. One last thing. One of the things you have to kind of contend with as well, if you actually read more about Seneca's life, is that many people criticize him for not actually living on his values, which is kind of ironic because some of the things he writes, one of the letters he writes is about how he's annoyed by how philosophers, to be real philosopher, you have to live out your own philosophy. You can't just say things. Many people are armchair philosophers. But a lot of the criticism towards him, particularly, is that he was also that way. He lived quite of a lavish life to some degree towards the end of his life. He had lots of power, he had lots of good things, and he was indulging in a lot of the stuff. But even though he was not the best example of his own philosophy, of his own word, even though he was very complex figure, a lot of what he says here is very useful, and I think it's very worth reading, and I'm glad that I tried to read. It took me like a month to read it. I was kind of it's pretty dense because there are many letters in there, and each letter you want to kind of just let percolate in your thoughts for the next few days maybe. But in general, I'm a big fan. I really like this. I'm very fascinated now with more older Roman writings. I read some of Epictetus, his writing, and I thought that was very good. So I'm thinking of reading more of that stuff. But yeah, Seneca, Letters from a Stoic. It's pretty good book.